What the dog doing? 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 What the dog doing?
Buy Cocoa Crunch!
What the dog doing? What the dog doing? What the dog doing? What the dog doing? What the dog doing?
Hello. Can I just confirm if I am clearly audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes,
Right.
Kuya.
Okay, thanks. Can I just do a verbal check for government if they're here and complete?
Job's here. Incomplete.
How about opposition?
Complete.
Okay. Can I ask if my panelists are here? Wait, sorry, I'm just pulling up the URL. Okay. Is Bianca here?
Hi, I'm here.
All right. Marianne, are you here?
Hi, here.
Okay. How about Raph?
Hi, I'm here.
And sorry, is this Yaney or Yaney? Sorry.
Any is fine po. Here
Okay.
po.
All right, cool. Everyone is here. And just to confirm, we are doing the second motion on the surveillance technology.
Yes, we are.
All right. So hello everyone. Welcome to the open semifinals of Cebu School's Pre-NASHDC. My name is Cherby and I'll be your chair. I'll let my panelists introduce themselves according to tab order, starting with Bianca.
Hi, Bianca. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Marianne. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Raph, one of the panel. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Yaney. Good luck.
Okay. Sorry, I just checked chat. I believe Tech will be live streaming this room. Can I ask Romel if it like the live stream is okay now and we are good to go? Okay. Just a few reminders before we start. First, speeches only until 7:15. Anything beyond that is no longer accounted for. Second, please be mindful of your preferences. If you have any gender pronoun or PI preferences, please do not forget to state them right before I start speaking. Last, let's please abide by the equity policy, so please do not badger, and please be mindful of your language all throughout the debate. Yes, with that out of the way, debating upon the motion, this House regrets the rise of surveillance technology, calling on Prime Minister to open the debate.
Okay, can I confirm that I'm visible and audible?
Yes to both.
Okay. Hold on, I'm just gonna set up my. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things that I'm going to do in this debate. Firstly, setup. Secondly, arguments. And thirdly, impacts. First, on setup then. What do we think surveillance technology looks like? We think that this most likely looks like CCTVs or flock cameras, or things that track your information, profiles you racially, and all of these stuff. I think most likely then that surveillance technology is expensive, and it can only be afforded by, or at least can only be used by things like corporations and states, which probably use tax money that should go to the protection of the people on the ground, which they instead invest manifest into mass like gatherings of surveillance technology. I think then that most likely surveillance technology is used by things like authoritarian states that want to exercise a sense of control on their people and at least who they're over. But I think that this is also exercised, or at least is also used by institutions and corporations. We as government then believe that there's no good reason for you to be using a lot of surveillance technology, or there's no good reason for the rise of the mass use of surveillance technology. While we do concede that it is good on the individual level, so for example, like good for you to like use it outside your house to make sure that there's no robbers or anything like that. I think it's bad when people have the money, or at least when these corporations and states have enough money to execute and access this data on a mass scale, or at least the data that they're able to get from the surveillance technology on a mass scale. This probably looks like, for example, the files of like Harvard students getting leaked and their data being like sent out, or at least being accessed to by like other institutions. I think that this is how it looks like when you have enough money, or at least you have enough like profit to be able to access this information and like on a mass scale. That's when this is generally bad. What then do we think the rise looks like? We think that the rise is actually simultaneous with the rise of authoritarian states and the rise of conservatism. And we think that most likely the reason why it has risen in the first place is because these authoritarian states and like these conservatives, or most likely these authoritarian states want to do have some sort of like control or power over the people, and I'm going to explain that more later. Why then do we regret the rise? We regret this because we think that it gives the state more authoritarian control, and we think that most likely it hurts and overpolices women and minorities and lets people's data be exploited unfairly on the ground. I also think that the reason why this is used is for these states, or at least these authoritarian states, or like these institutions, or most likely within the state, to track insurgent voices within society and exploit the data of individuals. This is the reason why you were asked to turn off your phone during protests, so that you are not going to get tracked by these people. I think it also looks like the reason why people are so terrified to protest, because it silences them on the ground. Let's look at our worst case then. I think our worst case most likely looks like that there's going to be no surveillance. I think that number one, we're talking about the rise within this debate. Therefore, there's no need for us to really worry about the loss of surveillance. We think that there's generally just going to be surveillance. But secondly, I think we're able to like trade off the possibility of like petty crimes, because there is an incentive for petty crimes. If, for example, a petty crime is like a man stealing bread from a store, we think that most likely that's also the problem of the state for not giving tax money to those who actually need money and like spend it on like surveillance technology. And in the worst case that opposition runs regulations, I'd like to point out that this is a retrospective debate, which means we don't have to look at like why surveillance technology is bad, and we don't have to have like a counterfactual on regulations. I think we need to look at what it has done in the past, and I want to explain that authoritarian and corps will not probably want to legislate it. And again, if you have enough money, and if you want to exercise your power, you're most likely not going to put legislations and regulations. The rise is there, even if this is not authoritarian. I think that the rise is still there. So for example, in the UK government, your data is digitized and accessible, and I think that the fact that your data is being put online, or at least accessed by other people besides yourself, I think that's also something that has to be a problem. Now, first argument then, I think that my first argument is to explain that it is principally unjust because this stifles democracy, and secondly, it hurts individuals. First argument then, I want to explain to you, like I already explained in frame, that surveillance technology is most likely going to track you. This means that they're going to have your data, they're going to have the information about you that through like stuff like your technology. So technology, we think that this technology isn't inherently a bad thing, but the fact that you are able to access this amount of data, that you're able to get your data tracked in the first place, is already bad. This is the reason why, for example, you turn off your phone while protesting or stuff like that, and that you're terrified because you're probably like these surveillance cameras are probably going to be able to track when you are going to these protests or when you are actively fighting against the authoritarian regimes in front of you. This is why people are terrified of losing their data, or they're terrified to act and protest in the first place. This is like, for example, this is the reason why it's most likely that China does not have the amount of protests, or at least they don't have a huge amount of protests because of the fact that the surveillance technology is most likely going to track them, and they're too afraid to be seen in that way. They're too afraid to put their voice out, and this is why this is principally unjust, because you are removing the voice of the people. You are removing the possibility for these people to speak out for what they believe in and speak out for what they believe is right, because they are too afraid to do this. The impact of this then is that the government, which needs control, or the state that needs control, will lessen opinions, and then the government won't serve the interests of the people, which basically cancels out the principle of democracy, in which the people should be putting their voice, or at least the people should be able to, they should have an equal amount of power, and it's a democracy, and have an equal amount of say. I think then the second layer to this is what's most likely going to happen is that you're going to have the over policing of women, and you're going to have children hurt. I think then that when you have the amount of data, or at least when you have surveillance technology, when you have an access, you have enough access to this data, you are able to exploit, you are given more incentive, or at least these states are given more incentive to exploit. So for example, this looks like women and children on the ground, or at least when districts in the US, for example, are over policed, this looks like more like minorities and women and children on the ground hurt. Because like I already explained, these surveillance technologies most likely profile you racially, so you are given more reason to exploit. You are exploited more likely on our side of the house. Second argument then is to prove why this is inherently, why the right is bad because of corporations. I think then that because surveillance technology is expensive, there are profit incentives for corporations to opt into this, because they feel like their partnerships, or at least the use of this surveillance technology, is going to be profitable for them. What does this look like? This looks like them going to be able to get your data based on your algorithm, or anything that you opt into, within your phone, since your phone already saves enough amount of your data, or even within these surveillance technologies, when they're able to get this information about you, and because they have the profit to do this, they can make, for example, targeted ads based on your user data. This is inherently bad, because the impact of this then is that your data is most likely going to get exploited. These companies are not going to care about the fact that they are taking away your data, but what they're going to care about is the fact that they can use your data to their expense, and they can use it to make more profit. The problem of this then is that you're also able to give more power to these corporations. Proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech, Pia. I'm calling a leader of the opposition.
Here, just wanted to check if I'm audible. Hello?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Let's just have me drink water. Hi, my name is Leanne, pronounced she, her. I'll accept POIs anytime. Just please don't badger me. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, on my first word. What happens to the woman who is abused behind closed doors when the only person who can see what happened is the person hurting her? Because the greatest gift of the rise of surveillance technology is not that it allows powerful people to watch us more closely. It is that for the first time, it gives vulnerable people the ability to make the powerful prove what they did. But I want to start with 2 technical call-outs. That one, government read the motion wrong. It's the rise of surveillance technology, not rise of surveillance. So all of your examples don't actually apply. But secondly, government just singles it out onto authoritarian regimes. Even if it's bad because it siphons democracy, authoritarian regimes aren't democratic in the first place. Absent surveillance, there's still a lot of abusive things happening. So there's a cost fallacy on government, but also their frame is too narrow and boxed out for this debate. Absent it, you're more likely to move into more harmful tactics, so I don't really get the mechanism for this. And I think this debate has to begin with one very important distinction, that government will spend this debate telling you about a world where surveillance technology is used by governments and abusive institutions to invade your privacy. And sure, those harms exist, but we pause it as early as LO. This is so much worse on your end without the rise, because notice how the most rational retrospective analysis is to say that without the rise of surveillance technology, these technologies remain locked in elite institutions, remain with the governments, which is significantly much worse on their end, because this means that accessibility is to these types of technology is significantly significantly much less likely in comparison to opposition. What does the rise look like, and why is it important? Reframe, because I think government did it wrong. I think the rise means that there's a rising amount of people who are able to access these kinds of technologies, including ordinary citizens that otherwise won't be able to. The rise means that cameras become cheaper, that body cameras become so normalized, security footage become like easier to preserve and distribute, for example. Means that ordinary people become capable of documenting things that previously would have existed only as someone's word against the word of a powerful institution, or like the word of Elon Musk, for example. Three keys of framing integrated with my responses. One, I want to first deal with their very unmechanized claim that surveillance creates a world where people are constantly watched and therefore less free. But notice that this characterization assumes that surveillance is only something done to people. We think this is a very unfair characterization. We think the most important change brought by the rise of surveillance technology is that ordinary people are now able to watch back. Cameras used to be used to be expensive, controlled by governments, for example, but now they are embedded in phones and like public spaces, which means that you as an ordinary citizens are able to document police misconduct, are able to document abuse and what have you in real time and distribute that evidence to thousands of people. So when government tells you that surveillance creates an imbalance of power, they have ignored the world where technology actually makes that power more contestable. But let's be charitable and grant government their strongest case. Let's say that they're right, that the rise of technology creates like a world where governments have far greater capacity to watch ordinary people and potentially weaponize this technology against vulnerable communities, in which case they didn't even mechanize, right? Even if I give them all of this, why do we still win? Because the problem is not the rise of surveillance technology itself. The problem is who is able to control it and whether there are mechanisms to hold these people accountable. And ironically, it's only within the rise of surveillance technology that's exactly what gives these ordinary people the capacity to create those mechanisms in the first place. The same technological development that gives a police officer a body camera gives a civilian a phone camera, for example. And once cameras become cheaper, once cameras become more accessible, accountability is no longer something that only governments can produce. So even in our worst case, the technology is distributed across society. In the worst case, the people in power remain able to abuse others without leaving evidence behind. That is the comparative you need to weigh. On our side, you might have more things that can potentially be abused, but you also have exponentially more capacity to detect, to expose, to punish that abuse. On their side, you don't just lose the harms of surveillance, you lose the evidence necessary to prove that those harms happened in the first place. And this is important because accountability does not happen simply because we tell people that misconduct is wrong. Accountability happens when there is evidence that cannot easily be denied in the first place. This looks like police officer abusing someone in an isolated street, for example. Under government's world, the victim can make an allegation and the officer can still deny it. Under opposition, there's a greater likelihood because there's a rise. There's probably like footage or probably body camera, for example, recording the incident. The rise, therefore, creates more opportunities for misconduct to become more visible. Notice the comparative. Gov tells you that like surveillance is invasive, but they cannot give you a better mechanism for proving that abuse happened. You cannot demand accountability while still simultaneously removing one of the cheapest and most accessible ways of documenting wrongdoing. Because notice on their side that their problem is that governments are able to track you, but that still happens because there is no surveillance technology. The problem on their side is that you lock these into elite institutions, which is far more worse because you are not able to democratize accountability. Secondly, Gov talks about the danger of institutions becoming abusive, but I think they fundamentally misunderstand what happens when surveillance becomes widespread. The rise of technology does not just make it easier to watch people, it makes it easier to establish standards for institutions themselves. When governments introduce body cameras, when public spaces have CCTVs, institutions know that their conduct can later be scrutinized. This changes the behavior before the crime even happens. It's literally just human psychology. People are not purely moral actors. They respond to the probability of being caught. If an individual believes that nobody can observe what they are doing, like the expected cause of misconduct becomes lower. And this is where our world is much more powerful than govs. But they want to wait until abuse occurs and they rely on institutions to punish it. We want to make abuse harder to commit in the first place. Prevention matters because you cannot always compensate someone after the harm. You can prosecute an abusive officer after the harm, but you cannot undo the trauma of the person who was abused. But on even if analysis, that even if it only prevents some misconduct, those are real people who never become victims in the first place. But thirdly, I want to talk about the issue of accessibility because I think this is where government's entire framing becomes backwards. They treat like the rise of surveillance technology as though it necessarily means that powerful institutions gain more tools to control ordinary people. But the rise also means that ordinary people gain tools that were previously inaccessible to them. The relevant comparative is not that be in a world where with surveillance, in a world where nobody watches anybody. That world does not exist. People will still commit crimes. The government will still exercise power. The question is, who has the ability to produce evidence when something goes wrong? Under God, the answer is disproportionately whoever already has the institutional power. Under our world, the answer increasingly includes the citizens with just simply a phone in their hand. That is important because the poorest and most vulnerable people are often the least capable of proving that they've already been harmed. They do not have lawyers following them around. They do not have private investigators. Surveillance technology gives them something much cheaper, a record of what actually happened. Even if Gov says that this technology can sometimes be abused, I want you to weigh the worst case properly. The worst case is that surveillance enables governments or institutions to invade privacy and abuse their power. Our worst case is that surveillance technology sometimes create privacy harms that we should regulate. Compare that to their worst case on their side. An abused an abused person has no evidence. A corrupt official can simply deny what happened. Vulnerable citizens are forced to fight institutions using nothing but their word against institutional power. This is far more worse. This is the rise we defend, not a world where everyone is watched by the powerful, because that still exists on their end, but a world where power itself becomes increasingly watchable. Proud to oppose.
Oh, sorry for the delay. Thank you so much for that speech. I'll call you on Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello. It would be great if we could have a more engaging round. So pronouns she, her, POIs, voice, I'll take whenever. Not whenever I can. Starting my speech. Oh, wait. Does everyone else consent to my speech being recorded? Like, op?
Op is fine.
Okay, cool. Right, sorry. Starting in my first word. Opposition's whole case is wrong because essentially they conflate surveillance with the mere use of technology and with mere cameras, right? So let's kill this entire case before I move on to our argument then. Firstly, we think on their point of individual surveillance being possible, assuming in the best case scenario where we buy into their framing that surveillance is just simple technology like being able to use your phone or being able to have a camera. We think this individual surveillance, no matter what they say, cannot counter the states. So you can't necessarily buy any of their impacts wherein you're able to be able to counter any sort of danger as an individual when you have much less power with your tiny iPhone compared to the state who has overseeing control of your data. But also number two, I think the fact that they're conflating simple technology with surveillance just proves that they don't have enough matter in this debate. And that is why their whole frame and therefore their whole case is wrong. Because we want to illustrate to you just simply, right, from Iole already, that this surveillance technology doesn't just look like cameras. This also looks like the flock cameras being used in the United States, or AI data centers being integrated within ICE. The argument then I want to do in this debate, and the argument I want to bring in this debate, is to prove the comparative world on our side of the house, exclusively, retrospectively, where government funds had been directed to more better things like social services that Iole talks about. And this expounds on her point of reducing things like crime and making people's lives just generally better and increasing the point of safety that opposition wants you to buy. This argument then engages with the most charitable and logical reason that surveillance might actually exist, which is for crime necessarily. The reasons then we explain to you this happens is number one, we want to characterize that surveillance technology is necessarily expensive, like Ayole explained to you, but it is also profitable or utilizable for corporations and also governments. That is why private-public partnerships exist in coordination, to be able to co-opt AI or like a data and technology that comes from AI in a way that can be used for surveillance. That means government surveillance, like the funding for government surveillance, necessarily takes away things like tax revenue for things like social service that could be reducing crime and could be increasing safety in favor of like surveillance and in favor of surveillance in general. We explained to you on our comparative world how the benefit trickles down, where social services get the most tax revenue in the alternative world, where in the alternative like scenario where taxes had not been used for surveillance, right? Firstly, we explained that the vast majority of people already have a demand for crime reduction because of the fact that it impacts them directly. So for instance, the fact that maybe you've been robbed at one point, or maybe your family or one of your friends has gone into a life of crime, means that you're more likely to means that you've seen the negative impact of crime on your life or on someone else's life that you care about, or how it has generally just hurt society and it has hurt people. Therefore, there's already a vast demand for crime to reduce. And we also want to characterize that the vast majority of crime complaints are petty anyway, which means that it is not necessarily surveillance, that's going to reduce these crimes, but most likely socioeconomic issues and social services that Ayole explained to you. Secondly, we explained that these social services could allow people to live alternative lifestyles, where instead of the state just putting you in jail or something, what they could do is instead put people make the economy better, for instance, or make people have more jobs so that they wouldn't have to resort to things like stealing bread from their local grocery store just to be able to feed themselves. We explained then the exclusive benefit, which is that if in the instance where crime reduces, you have society which is more like cohesive in general, and people are able to commune better with each other insofar as there are less tensions because of crime and people are less negatively impacted by simple things like petty crime. We also explained that this reduces the problems of things like overfilled jails or like mass incarceration, especially targeted against people like people of color, that I already explained to you. The comparative is quite simple and it goes twofold. Firstly, on safety then. Firstly, we explained to you that safety cannot occur from surveillance like opposition wants you to believe. Because even if it is the case that surveillance as an individual can provide you some means to protect yourself, the problem is, we already explained that this individual surveillance is not necessarily able to counter the state's power or what the state is capable of doing when they engage with like big corporations like OpenAI in order to co-opt surveillance into the state and into society, right? And so the problem is things like personal safety and like personal interests are not necessarily able to be more like achievable because of the fact that, number one, it's harder for you to do things like protest against the state, and therefore it's harder for you to like protect your rights as an individual when this authoritarian state is actively going against your interests. The second thing we explain under this first part of our comparative, which is that crime and law is essentially gets to be determined by a regime, such as the authoritarian regimes and status quo. So the problems that opposition explains to you about like crime increasing or like police departments being able to counter crime because of the fact like, you have more body cameras, we explained to you that number one, already a lot of people are targeted, like a lot of police essentially place their departments or like place their efforts into areas with high crime already, and not necessarily because those areas need more crime fixing, but because of the fact that they use like more violent methods to be able to counter crime instead of using things like improving the economy to just help people's lives become better. And so when crime and law gets to be determined by a regime, not necessarily by any democratic by an authoritarian regime, and not necessarily by any democratic principles, the problem is we don't know to what extent something is considered illegal. We don't know to what extent you can protect your rights. I think also then, lastly, on safety, you're able to help the oppressed and marginalized more when protests become easier to mobilize and become more possible insofar as your rights as you're less afraid as an individual to go out and fight for your rights. Lastly, then really quickly on our comparative is on data protection. Because notice what the surveillance technology already is provided by AI corporations through private-public partnerships, right? Which has justified the continued infiltration of user data in society, but also you ultimately cannot consent to authoritarian policies that are equipped by these technological corporations in the first place. We think for all these reasons and more, government wins.
Thank you so much for that speech, DPM calling on Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Ysabel, pronouns she, her. POI anytime, just please don't badger, and preferably through voice because I'm not gonna look at chat. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2. Sorry, my timer is like wait long. Sorry, my timer's like being crazy. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If there's anyone that doesn't understand this motion, it's government. The rise of surveillance technology is literally what caused it to become cheaper, more accessible, and more distributed, along with everything that comes bundled with it, like cloud storage that lets an ordinary person capture and share what is used to require an institution's budget and an institution's permission. Gov wants to debate this motion as if the rise froze at its most expensive, most centralized starting point. What Lynn explained to you is that it didn't, and that's an unfair framing. The entire direction of the rise has been downward in cost and outward in access, and that direction is the thing they need to engage with, not like they're trying to ignore with their case, right? But before the rise, notice how the state could lose an isolated incident quickly because one person's account could be denied, discredited, or buried. You have one witness with no footage, for example, that the account ties in a report that nobody reads. What the rise removes is the state's ability to control the narrative unchallenged because footage from an iPhone doesn't need the state's permission to exist. You do not need an editor's permission to spread, and you don't have to stay contained to one's witness. The individual doesn't need to match the state's power. That is not our burden. What we only need to prove is that they only need to break the monopoly on being believed. That's exactly what the rise hands to them. But to then respond to them, right, on data protection, notice how that's literally not from surveillance tech. Like, that doesn't cost like you being breached. You literally open Shopee and you search for hair serum, and that's exactly the ads that show up on your IG and FB reels. I don't get their case unless it's like China who's trying to like get your data, for example. But if government's case were true, notice that this technology only ever concentrates power upward. The trend should have gotten worse the further it rose, but it didn't. The further it rose, the cheaper it got, and the more people it reached, the harder it became for any single actor, state, or otherwise any authoritarian they're talking about to control what is seen and who gets believed. We think that's not a coincidence. That is the mechanism we are trying to prove with the rise itself, working exactly the way we have shown you all around. If opposition is, if we are wrong and the rise causes more harm than good, the check on that harm is the very accountability infrastructure we spent that actually exists in this round. We have the oversight, you have aggregation, you have surveillance, and you have legal frameworks catching up to these institutions. If government is wrong and the rise actually helps far more than they admit, the cost of what we've talked ourselves into regretting the exact tools that expose abuse and push policy towards restricting or slowing something that was like protecting the powerless, note how on our side, this error is self-correcting. Their side, on their error, it's you're locked in a world with less visibility, right, when the visibility is doing much of the most protective work. That asymmetry alone, it shows you how much wider our case is compared to this. But lastly, I want to respond to the fact that you're able to get your data tracked in the first place is already bad. Leon responded to this pragmatically, that once capacity is decentralized, the misuse by any single actor becomes exponentially harder to hide because that actor is no longer the only one recording a device. Note that the state trying to quietly misuse surveillance data now has to worry about being caught not just by an internal audit, but by an independent citizen like Allane filming the same event from across the street with her cheap, accessible, high-quality CCTV. I bite back through that response through principle because notice how Gov is asserting that tracking is intrinsically harmful without telling you why. Note that being observed is not the same as being harmed. A person walking past a CCTV camera experiences literally nothing different in terms of the moment of a person walking past an empty wall. The harm government wants you to feel only materializes if that data is later misused. Notice how this likely happens on their side through Leah's explanation of monopoly. My first extension then is that the rise of redistributes power downward, not just upward. This is me conceding and biting into their case that you have better surveillance networks for institutions or how you have corporations getting better data harvesting. I think we're never going to be left out of a technology that scales. I concede that fully. But here's the question that government needs to answer, and I don't think they can. Does the fact that elites also gained access mean the marginal gain to ordinary people is zero or even negative? I say no, because the benefit to the powerless was never measured against a world where they only have the tool. It is measured against the world that existed before the rise, where they had nothing, and the state or the institution had everything because of how expensive surveillance technology was. I want to add a second layer here, that the rise of this technology also means that the rise of surveillance is used for the population, not just on it. One, take satellite monitoring as a clean example on how governments now use satellite surveillance to detect the foreign vessels from the West Philippine Sea, for example, or how you monitor air and maritime borders for incursions that threaten your national sovereignty. Note that the surveillance technology is rising in a form that has nothing to do with tracking an individual citizen's data or profiling anyone racially. It is the state using the exact same category of technology to protect its people from external threat. So why does this matter for the round? Because it proves that government's harm isn't a property of the technology, it's a property of the target. The same satellite capability that could theoretically be pointed inwards at citizens is in this case pointed outward at the foreign incursions, and that's a protective use, not the repressive one that they're trying to prove. If government's case were true, then the rise of surveillance tech is inherently about state control over its own people, which probably would have so many backlash around people, would probably still have so much like protest against, hey, you're taking my data using what we call this surveillance, for example. Obviously, the rise wouldn't have even happened in the first place. I feel this surveillance as to how it also gets used to protect the vulnerable state from the more powerful one. This means it's no longer just China using like surveillance camera to check the West Philippine Sea, for example. You also allow the Philippines to utilize it because of how much it's so much more cheaper and accessible. This means that smaller nations without the massive militaries can increasingly also rely on satellite data and surveillance data because they share that through international partnerships, for example, because of how everything is much more connected with the rise, where you're able to document and publicize insertions by larger, more powerful states. That is the same mechanism as my earlier point about how ordinary citizens documenting police abuse. I just scaled it up to the level of the nations. The rise of this technology lets the weaker party prove that what happened to them in a domain where the world alone would have never been believed against a stronger neighbor. Why is this true? Because historically, there were only two walls between an ordinary person holding power accountable. Wall one is the cost of capturing evidence, which is literally in the hands of the institutions, the very people you need evidence against. Wall two is the cost of distributing that evidence, which is used to require the editor's permission and network approval and what have you. This is where we talk to you about an entirely new category of accountability, which is aggregation. This happens through one, the reduction in cost of storage and searchability. It is not enough for the footage to exist. It has to be findable, cross-referenceable, and combinable. As the technology rose, so did the infrastructure around it, where you have cheaper storage, for example. But secondly, the network distribution, which is what makes the pattern public rather than private, even if government says that an institution internally aggregated evidence before, the rise of network technology is what lets the aggregation reach the public in real time. Absent the rise, it only became public if the institution holding the pattern decided to release it, or if the court eventually forced the disclosure years later. How do we fix this on our side? Notice how because network distribution is what turns the scattered raw material into public pattern, that is it specifically requires a rise. For the scattered footage to become a visible pattern, it has to be findable and combinable by people outside the institution, where you no longer need permission from ABS-CBN to release this, for example. The capture device and the distribution work rose in tandem, specifically because modern surveillance technology is built as network technology from the start. You cannot make a phone camera as a standalone recorder that someone later figured out how to upload. It was literally designed from the point of its rise as a device that captures and transmits the same motion. I feel like government still has to buy to our framing that a lot of these benefits that you can get, that you get cheaper satellites, you get cheaper cloud storage for people like Allane, for example, only happens under our side. On government's world, the people who lose the most are the ones who are already losing before the rise. You literally have a witness with no camera, a victim with no proof, and a small state like the Philippines with no satellites. On our world, the people who gain the most are those exact same people. So even if you're not fully sure on who wins on raw quantity on harms versus benefits, ask yourself who each world is built for. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech, DLO calling on government.
Hello, am I audible?
Visible and visible, yes.
Thank you. It's so sad. I could have gotten the grants, but unfortunately, opposition told me that my war against an authoritarian state can be won with a shitty iPhone 11. The ultimate reason why they cannot win is because right from the start, it's a debate about the rights, and Yola says within the second minute of her speech that people are still going to have technologies that allow them to generally survey things, whether that be the fact that they have iPhones or the fact that they have things like cameras. But secondly, and this is imperative, that the way that surveillance technology works is not singularly cameras. And this is something that you hear constantly down the bench of opposition, that it's important that civilians have cameras, that it's important that civilians can see what is going wrong in the world. But ultimately, that is something that has been happening since the 1980s, where we had journalists and people taking things with digital handheld cameras because of the fact that they want to document things such as the atrocity of the state. Ultimately, then the issue is not documentation, because it has always been equal from the moment in time that cameras started existing and people were allowed to take things such as photos. So that means that ultimately the rise does not aid more. But secondly, I want us to go back to what Yola and Chloe characterized as the rise. It looks like the fact that currently, with the current rise of conservatism and the shift to right-wing ideologies, you have things such as states ultimately applying more surveillance than is normal. That is already what Chloe and Yola says, but simultaneously, this is also when Yola says in the 5th minute of her speech that time and time again, it is not just going to be authoritarian states, but it's going to be any state that wants to express a certain level of control amongst its constituents and citizens so that they are capable of doing 3 things. 1, stifling protest and dissent. 2, incentivizing themselves, whether that be through profit, to align with private corporations, whether that be through OpenAI and its usage in ICE to track down people of color. But thirdly, to over-police marginalized people in the first place. This is something already we see within status quo, because ultimately, opposition debates in a vacuum of where most people are capable of always being the perfect victim, always recording and documenting every single crime they have, always making sure that they themselves can always see everything. But ultimately, this is impossible, and right from the start, unproductive when it comes to the idea of trying to get justice from them. Ultimately, you get it right away from Yole when she explains in her speech that the only way to make sure that all of these atrocities are not generated or even countered in the first place is to have surveillance not so strong that people can actively unionize and work together to protest, to fight the government, to unionize against the oppressiveness and make sure that they are incapable getting these things in the first place. And that is the prerequisite to even getting any of that information. So notice how even on an intuitive weighing, one iPhone against a group collective who actively fight the government because of the fact they have significantly less surveillance and are allowed to do so, ultimately wins over terms of systemic change. But let's leave it to individual then, because they notice that on their side of the house, it's significantly better because you can do things such as record crimes. Notice then, ultimately, the people that they try to benefit here are marginalized people, which we think that is somewhat of a good cause, but ultimately wins more on Yola and Chloe because of the fact that they explained that right from the start, these people are over marginalized because of the fact they are over policed. Whether that's African American, US constantly being targeted, immigrants in ICE constantly being targeted at the same time because their information is fed through these systems and given through mass surveillance, like the fact that AI is used in ICE to target these people, or flock cameras in the US. Ultimately, it comes to the individual realization that the problem is over surveillance, and no amount of you taking documentation with those crimes ultimately takes place when you cannot have the collective action to do so because you are unfairly targeted due to this mass surveillance. But secondly, and this is most important, because of the fact that ultimately, even then, you are still not believed. Chloe touches up on this because of the fact that in more person, when you are a marginalized community, you ultimately cannot be engaged with to this level because you are one person against the state. The state is not as likely to believe you. Notice how then in context of collective action immediately already wins, because if you are one person who is as marginalized and as defeated and as unlikely to win any case as opposition already explains, then it means the only intuitive way to get out of that is already from our prime minister. Ultimately, that is a wash. But before I go on, Yoan,
Absent theorized, all of those harms are exactly what happens. Surveillance technology exists, yes, but only is saturated within rich and capable countries. Looks like China being advanced on AI and weaponizing this to taunt neighboring countries.
And when did China start getting advanced in AI? Around the 2020s. The existence of things such as cameras and images and videos have been existing literally ever since we had handheld iPhones, which is 2000s or even the active 90s, where we all had digital cameras and could take photos of things. If the entire concept of your case is that we want to take pictures and take videos, then you don't even have to go back so far because of the fact that we had handheld digital cameras and ways to take photos and ways to disseminate information even before that. The rise of an iPhone is not unique to the who are capable of doing this. But also secondly, the fact that you guys do not engage in the fact that surveillance technology is not just going to be cameras, it is going to be the mass digitalization of your information, the accessibility of that information. And that is why Chloe's case ultimately goes against what you guys are trying to say, because the fact that they said to you that right from the start, when you have things like private-public partnerships, it immediately works. Your deputy also explains this to me when you guys say it's going to be used like things in the military, where you do things such as surveillance for military, where you do things such as satellites, and even by extension, that can be things such as missiles, automatically used to target civilians, like we see in certain wars right now. Things like ICE constantly using it to deport people, or even things like in China where protests and silences are forcibly applied because of the fact that you ultimately cannot congregate due to the surveillance. Notice how this is just intuitively bad and how it's never really fault on their side of the house because their always is only that maybe individual people can surveil. But let's take everything I said is wrong and let's say nothing I've said is ever true. Why then are we still pragmatically correct? It is individually on 2 points. One, that in the worst case scenario where maybe you are capable of fighting back as an individual and maybe fighting back against the state, this is completely reliant on you having the right resources. That is completely reliant on you being the perfect victim. If you're a woman trying to record a cop abusing you, you have to not be drunk. You have to not be wearing clothing that is otherwise revealing, and you need to have enough money to pursue the lawsuit in the first place. And secondly, it is reliant on the state even being in a position where you're capable of being believed, because we can see that even in progressive developed states like the UK, where a woman does things like get assaulted, she is still going to be the person blamed for recording because of the privacy laws that don't allow them to record things like law enforcement in the first place. So ultimately, you intuitively realize that this can't work. The only way you're gonna ever be capable of this is by unionizing and getting collective action. And the collective action is what is necessary to get the prerequisite of change. But even if change, the long-term change, and this is the retrospective aspect of the debate that opposition unfortunately cannot win on. Because notice the fact here that on our side of the house, even if change happens, it happens long-term because of the fact that it comes from people collectively unionizing and making sure that they can fight against the government. It gives them the leveraging power to constantly be able to discuss what is wrong democratically with that country, what is wrong with this authoritarian state, and giving them the power to be able to combat it because they can congregate, they can do things such as lead protests, they can do things such as come together and make sure that they are capable of overturning these things. Intuitively, that just way stronger. And for 3 specific reasons: the capacity to be able to do these things and make long-term changes working faster, the urgency because of things like authoritarian and right-wing ideologies constantly flourishing within status quo because of the shift to conservatism. But thirdly, on consequence, because the consequence at the end of the day, it means that you do not have to be the perfect victim in order to make sure that you get the systemic change you want. It is obvious then, on any side or any part, that it only can be government, us.
Thank you so much for that speech, Gov Whip. Now calling on opposition whip.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I survived. Starting my speech in 3. Wait. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Sharing my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's give it to government. If they when we tell them they're right that surveillance can invade privacy, empower authoritarian states, and be abused by institutions with more power. But notice how government has been barely charitable to us from the beginning. They take the worst possible use of surveillance, assume the most powerful actors will always control it, and then ask you to regulate its rise as though accessibility has changed nothing, for example. But notice how the rise of surveillance technology has also changed who gets to produce the evidence, because the clearest example is George Floyd's, for example, murder, where a bystander recording the incident created evidence that became central to challenging the official account of what happened. That's the shift that we celebrate. The ability to document wrongdoing is no longer something only governments and powerful institutions, for example, can possess. A few call-outs then. First, when government says that surveillance is expensive and therefore controlled by the powerful, notice how this ignores the direction of technological change. The rise is precisely what makes surveillance more accessible. The technology becomes cheaper, smaller, easier to operate, and integrated into devices people already own. You no longer need the resources of a state to create a record of what happened in front of you, for example. But then second, when government tells us that surveillance technology is profitable and therefore data exploitation is inevitable, notice how they're already blaming surveillance technology for a broader problem of data collection. I question this because surveillance technology does not inherently create targeted advertising. You open Shopee, search for a hair serum, for example, and suddenly that's exactly what appears on your Insta and FB Reels. The issue is how platforms collect and use data, which is a regulatory problem that does not erase the benefits of recording technology that can expose wrongdoing. But then third, when government says that individual surveillance cannot override the power of the state, notice how this assumes that the only valuable outcome is completely defeating state surveillance. It doesn't need to, because one recording does not need to overpower a state. It only needs to create evidence that the state cannot simply deny. But then fourth, notice how they didn't even bite our most important case, that instead of engaging with the core benefit of accessible surveillance, like ordinary people gaining the ability to document and challenge powerful institutions, for example, they keep centralizing the debate on authoritarian states and other countries. Even if their examples are true, they don't answer why we should regret a technological rise that also gives individuals greater access to evidence. But then on the clash of accountability. Notice how the rise changes the direction of evidence. I've already said that. I'll say it again. That before powerful institutions could often control both the surveillance and the official account of what happened. That with more accessible technology, ordinary people can create independent records that challenge those accounts. That matters because accountability works through two mechanisms. First, evidence, and second, deterrence. Evidence allows misconduct to be challenged after it happens, with the possibility of being recorded can change behavior before it happens. For example, but then government says individuals cannot match the state's surveillance capacity. We agree, but they don't need to because the value comes from making it harder for powerful institutions to control the entire narrative. I rather. But then let's widen the gap then. Because what happens without the rise? This is where government's framing fundamentally fails. Because they spend this debate telling you about the harms inside a world where surveillance technology has already risen. They tell you what happens when states misuse it, when corporations exploit data, and when authoritarian governments gain more sophisticated tools, right? But the motion asks you to regret the rise itself. So notice what happens outside that rise. You return to a world where sophisticated surveillance remains concentrated among the institutions that barely have money, political authority, and technical capacity. The state will still have the ability to monitor people. Corporations still have the incentive to collect information. Authoritarian governments still have the desire to control narratives. But the difference is that ordinary people have fewer tools to respond. A person who's wrongly accused has less ability to produce evidence, for example. And another example is a victim of institutional abuse has less ability to independently document what happened. The powerful do not suddenly stop watching here. They simply face less resistance from below, and that's exactly why Ysabel and Lian has been so important. That's the central asymmetry government never resolves. But the rise does not create a world where only the powerful can surveil. It creates a world where surveillance become increasingly available to people outside traditional institutions as well. But even if the rise creates new harms, those harms can be addressed through regulation. Governments can impose privacy protections, and limit data retention and punish misuse, for example. But you cannot regulate your way into recreating evidence that was never even captured in the first place. You can't just retroactively give someone a recording that could have proved their innocence, right? But the harm of surveillance misuse is a governance problem that can be corrected. The absence of accessible surveillance creates an information gap that can never be repaired after the fact. This is why our worst case remains preferable. But then let's look at the crime and the premise of their case. That government says surveillance leads to over policing and excessive arrest, right? Notice how this confused surveillance with the decision to criminalize and punish, because a camera does not decide whether a petty offense deserves imprisonment. A prosecutor more professionals do, and there are already systems that exist with that. I question their premise because evidence itself is neutral. The same recording that can identify wrongdoing can also disprove an accusation and expose police misconduct or show that someone was wrongly targeted. For example, if their concern is excessive punishment coming from government, the solution is obviously sentencing reform and better criminal justice policy, instead of actually regretting technology that can also protect people from false accusations at the very end of the day. But the problem is what institutions do with information, not the existence of information itself. But let's go on to the weighing then. Here, government gives you a world where surveillance technology is increasingly powerful and increasingly capable of being abused. Let's grant that. But notice the comparative. Inside the rise, there are genuine risks where privacy violations, data exploitation, and state overreach. But outside the rise, those risks do not disappear. The states will still have power and corporations will still have incentives, right? But what disappears is the ability of ordinary people to independently document and challenge them. This is why their world is fundamentally worse. But government focuses on whether surveillance makes the powerful more powerful. But we ask you to look at the relative distribution of information and yeah, oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech, Whip. That concludes this substantive part of the debate. Now calling on opposition reply.
Here.
Hi, LO. I'll do op reply. I'll start my speech. Wait, sorry. In three, on my first word. Oh. I'd rather be the person complaining that someone took a picture of me than the person asking why did nobody record what happened when I was being abused. Because between having my privacy slightly violated and having my safety completely violated, I think the choice is pretty obvious. Gov never actually biased on our most important case, which is that you centralize these surveillance technologies to other powerful countries and not third world countries, which is probably going to be the reason why China will always be overpowering Philippines at the end of the day. 5 key issues I want to weigh. That one, I want to first deal with the issue of what happens when surveillance technology does not rise, because I think this is the biggest unanswered question on government's case. God tells you that surveillance allows authoritarian governments to track people and invade privacy and commit abuses. Fine, even if every single one of those harms is true, why is this world better? Authoritarian states do not suddenly become benevolent because cameras become less accessible. They simply revert to older and often more coercive mechanisms like physical intimidation, like detention, for example, or direct coercion, for example. The difference is that these things become substantially harder for ordinary people to detect and prove. On our side, at least, at the very least, on side opposition, at least the abuse can leave a digital footprint. A police body cam, for example, a CCTV footage, or even a social media post can become evidence that something actually abusive happened. The world does not eliminate state violence. It removes one of the strongest tools victims have to prove that it happened. But they have literally zero to no mechanism at all on how they are able to solve these problems. At the end of the day, they just keep introducing more and more problems. But God doesn't actually have a mechanism and an argument explicitly for accountability. No engagement in our case, because what they want to do is to tell you that it's always going to be the governments and institutions who are able to access all these kinds of information and data. As early as LO, we are already able to call out this framing, because this framing of the riots is literally so wrong and just unfair. The correct framing only comes from opposition. We were able to tell you that this doesn't just need more cameras, but also cheaper cameras and more normalized body cameras, for example. But this also looks like the satellite-like imagery, for example, and machinery coming from my deputy being cheaper and easier to produce. That can only happen only on opposition. You are able to democratize this form of surveillance, but the web case of being a perfect victim assumes the alternative is a world where victims are automatically believed. It isn't. Without surveillance, you still need to prove what happened. You just have less evidence to do it. At least on our side, the camera does not ask you to be the perfect victim. It just gives you enough evidence to actually stand by your own right. But secondly, I want to talk about mass digitalization and accessibility, because government completely misses why we defend the rise rather than simply surveillance technology existing in the abstract. The point of technological progress is surveillance becomes significantly cheaper and more accessible. This matters because surveillance is no longer something that only the richest governments are able to afford, like how militaries can able to afford this, like how China has more capacity to subscribe to these things, for example, in comparison to the Philippines. The rise is able to democratize the ability to observe, and notice how devastating this is to their case. Absent the rise, powerful states and militaries can still surveillance like people, for example, using whatever technologies they already possess, but ordinary people have far fewer means of watching back. The rise changes the balance and this relationship, because of the ability to document abuse is no longer exclusive only to the powerful. But we already explained that you are more likely to be able to stop crime before it even happens, because the human psychology, if you know someone is watching you, you do not do something bad. But thirdly, I want to talk about vulnerable people, because it's where comparative becomes most important. Imagine like abused women, for example, whose partner knows there will never be evidence. God tells you that surveillance threatens vulnerable people, but they never answer the far more important question: what happens to vulnerable people when nobody can see what is being done to them? Under opposition, the rise of surveillance gives these people evidence and leverage. It makes it harder for powerful actors to simply deny what happened, and etc. The benefit is not merely that crime is punished afterwards. Surveillance changes these incentives beforehand, because people are less likely to commit misconduct when they know that there's a greater possibility of being caught. But fourth, I want to weigh the harms of surveillance against the harms of this absence. God's world sounds attractive because they describe privacy as if it's the absolute good, but privacy is not meaningful when it becomes a shield for the powerful. The worst case is that someone can watch you. Our worst case is that someone can watch you and you can watch them back. Their world is one where physical coercion and abuse can still continue without documentation. At least on our side, you are able to have better possibility of overreach, but also creates the technology technology and evidence and like public visibility necessary to expose that overreach. And lastly, I want you to weigh this on who gets protected and who gets left behind. Because on Gov's case, they assume that without the rise, powerful institutions somehow lose the ability to surveil. But that's not simply not how the world works, for example. That's why we do not forget the rise, not because surveillance is inherently harmful or like harmless, but because a world where abuse can be seen, recorded, and proven is fundamentally better than a world where abuse continues in the dark. Proud to oppose. Upland.
Thank you so much for that speech of reply. Now to conclude this debate, calling on government reply.
Let's shift the cam a bit. Cause like, okay. Hold on. Starting in 3, 2, 1. First, before I begin with my analyzation of the two clashes, I want to ask opposition a question. I want to ask on whether or not who exactly is the average individual who is surveilling in the first place. Because note that in the vast majority of cases, surveillance is done by a governing body overseeing with some kind of technology. This is extremely important and crucial to the debate because opposition makes this huge assertion that surveillance technology is going to be used by the individual. But even if we bite into that bullet and say, sure, okay, for some reason they're going to be doing this, I think that it's difficult for them to prove that individuals are going to be able to get this justice in the first place. We already explained to you, and this is the first clash then, on the capacity to counter state when injustice happens to an individual. Where are you more likely to get justice in the first place? Opposition tries to explain to you that, oh, it is the individual when they're able to record these things with their camera, note that this is not surveillance technology, and they say that like, oh, because of this, you're able to get justice. And they give us one example of George Floyd. I want to note that number one, the fact that this is one victim compared to the thousands of families targeted by ICE using surveillance technology. This is one victim mentioned over groups who have been over policed by states due to the use of surveillance technology. They keep saying that we center our entire debate on authoritarian states, but they never challenged our frame on this. We explain what happens because of the rise as well. I want to prove to you then that on our side of the house, what then happens is that we prove that you have the power to fight collectively, where they say that like, oh, one piece of evidence of abuse is going to help you fight back. You already put the burden of justice on the individual when that should be the state's burden of justice. On our side of the house, we prove to you that the person is able to fight when they have more liberty to protest and they are not worried about their data being tracked when these minorities. And note that even on their side of the house where the rise happens, and let's bite into the bullet where they say that like the price lowers, even the poorest of people who cannot afford cameras are going to be able to collectively protest, are going to be able to collectively go out on the street and protest without being afraid to speak out or at least call out these people for the injustices they do. So even if surveillance occurs on the individual level, which we already proved wrong because this is most likely done by governing bodies in the first place, it occurs simultaneously in states. That only happens when it occurs simultaneously in states where democracy is deteriorating. Scattered footage, there's no power to fight back. This is reliant on the assertion that individuals have enough power to fight back alone in the first place with a single piece of evidence that isn't even surveillance technology in the first place. You are assuming that they have the power to fight against the state who has more lobbying power than you, and that is why we regret the rise in the first place. Second clash then on the individual and society's safety. We explained to you that number one, with the rise, you are more likely to get data exploitation, you're most likely to get over policing, you're going to get tracking, control, and you're going to remove this democracy, or at least you're going to make this democracy slowly disappear. Op then explains that the rise somehow lowers the price, but we already explained to you that even the poorest of actors and the most marginalized, they're not able to help. This debate is about surveillance technology in which your data gets exploited. It's not just cameras, it's not just what opposition tries to paint, it's also your data being used by the government, abused by the state, mostly used by governing bodies. Let's bring up the George Floyd example again. That was one victim over thousands that the state was able to use with the rise of surveillance technology. The reason why we win the second clash then is because we are able to prove to you that we are able to ensure the safety of the individual in the first place, where they are unafraid to protest, where they are unafraid and they aren't scared that their one piece of evidence will not be overlooked by the state. Because think about it, let's say that you actually have an individual who has evidence of abuse. How can you prove that they will be able to counter the state by this? And even in the worst case that this actually actually happens, what about the hundreds and thousands of people who the state used surveillance technology on, to be ripped away from their families, to be taken away, and to be even more marginalized than opposition likes to admit? Proud to propose.
For that speech, Gov reply, that concludes the open semi-final. We now cross the house. To my panelists, let's go to the libs room, please. Results will be announced. Meeting. Thank you.
Cross. Thank you.
Cross.
Around.
Cross, thanks.